Now, I will use plain language. I fear that the United States has already decided that when it is ready, it will create a pretext for a war against Iran. That is what I believe. I acquit the Foreign Secretary of being in that hawkish clan, because insofar as one can penetrate the inscrutable corridors of power and their inhabitants, he seems to be a bit of a dove. But let me say this too, without offence. Britain is a minor player in this game. We've had the debate today as if everything hinged on whether the Prime Minister decided to go to war. The Prime Minister is a minor player in this unfolding tragedy. She decided to go in with the President, maybe because of the transatlantic relationship, the so-called special relationship, as thanks for the Falklands, because she didn't want to get mixed up with the EEC. But she's a minor player. And once she decided, and the Cabinet decided, to commit even a notional number of air forces and RAF regiment, and now the troops, she is locked into what President Bush intends to do. I am opposed to a war against Iraq. I am opposed to action outside the United Nations. I believe it would divide the Security Council. I believe it might not exactly unite the Arab world, but might bring many Arab countries together against us. And I think the outcome of such a war could not assure, because President Saddam Hussein would certainly have the capacity, were he to choose to do it, to destroy so many oil installations that though he himself might be destroyed, it would inflict a burden upon the world economy and the Middle East which could not be contemplated. I believe the sanctions will be effective, but I think you have to set this up against what would happen otherwise. I must also say something else to the House, without in any way being offensive, because governments are not of any colour in any country the main proponents and practitioners of morality. But to hear the United States, which went into Panama, 3,000 people were killed, and to talk about the right of international... America went into Grenada. America supported Iraq when they attacked Iran. America did nothing when Cyprus was invaded and partitioned by Turkey. America has no moral authority, any more than any superpower. And the same would be true of the Soviet Union about Afghanistan or whatever. Has no moral authority. Nor, might I add, because these things had better be said because nobody else has said them, when we're defending the Emir or the King of Saudi Arabia, none of these people practice any democracy whatever. And I'm not saying they aren't entitled to the protection of the Charter, because I've said it already, but when I think of the denunciations of the breaches of human rights in Eastern Europe by ministers, wouldn't you have expected one of them in this dispute would have pointed out you have your hand chopped off for shoplifting in Riyadh? Are we to live in a world where somehow morality is a product of a parliamentary majority? Now, the real issue is this, and everybody knows it, and nobody has mentioned it. The Americans want to protect their oil supplies. I think I'm right in saying not a single member on either side of the House tonight has drawn attention to what the former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, said on the radio last night. He said, we forced Saudi Arabia to accept our army there because we wanted to protect our oil. Now, we are experienced as an imperial power. That won't shock the party opposite, not ask it to shock anybody. I'm only asking us to recognize a fact when it stares you in the face. Then there is the arms trade. Now, that has been brought out a bit. I was in Algiers a couple of years ago, and I met a former Egyptian foreign minister who told me they'd just had a seminar in Cairo about the Crusades. And during the Crusades, European arms manufacturers supplied arms to Richard Coeur de Lion and to Saladin. So nothing really changed. The arms manufacturers have made billions of pounds out of selling instruments of mass destruction, partly to hold down these colonial peoples so that the the sheikhs will supply the cheap oil, and partly because it's highly profitable to sell arms. Now, I ask the House also to consider this. If we're going to war, and there are those who think we might, what are our war aims? Not an unreasonable question. Is it to free Kuwait? Is it to topple Hussein? Is it to destroy Iraqi weapons? My right honourable friend, the leader of the opposition, went further, actually, than the Prime Minister in setting the objective. Is it to arrest Saddam Hussein and bring him to an international war crimes tribunal? That Prime Minister said that on television. Are you going to send British troops in to fight until you've clarified what it's about? The government has never made it clear. The answer is, it is for the reason I gave. The United States, having helped to arm Saddam Hussein, is determined to bring him down and establish a base. I urge caution, Mr. Speaker. I urge caution, because it is not the hardware of military weapons that frightens me, because a gun can't go off. It is the hatred that makes people want to use them. That is the fuel of war. And in the last month, we've had the most vicious war propaganda pumped down our throat. And the temper of peace, of which Pandit Nehru used to speak, the temper of peace is what we need. We want to be cautious, and we want to let it work its way through the United Nations. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, and it wouldn't have been possible without some help from the chair, I intend to divide the House against the adjournment motion tomorrow. This is an evasion of ministerial responsibility on a matter of public policy. Now, of course, we've discussed so much the conduct of ministers, we've somewhat forgotten that this whole story is part of a very unhappy record of British relations in the Middle East, which my honourable friend is going to raise again on Friday. Iraq was part of the world we took over when the Ottoman Empire disappeared. Britain bombed Iraq with chemical weapons in the 1920s, and a few months ago the Queen Mother put up a statue to the man who did it. Bomber Harris was the squadron leader who used chemical weapons against Iraq. We planned to occupy Kuwait in 1958, and it all came out with the papers when Selwyn Lloyd wrote to Foster Dulles and said, we might take over Kuwait as a crown colony. And the double standards of British policy in the Middle East is the thing that will be noticed by anyone in the Arab world who reads this debate. We didn't take the view we did about Kuwait when Turkey invaded Cyprus, when the occupied territories were taken over by Israel. This Gulf War, looked at in the light of what we now know, was a war for profit, a war for oil, and a war for the control of the area. And now we are suddenly told that ministers who protested so vigorously about their defence of democracy and human rights were selling weapons to Saddam Hussein, who was repressing Kurds and Shiites before and after the war, and then saying it was just a question of flexible guidelines. 200,000 Iraqis were killed last year by forces including our own. 150,000 Iraqi babies under 5 were expected to die by the Harvard medical team that looked at the bombing of the water supply by British, American and French bombers. And it is an act of odious hypocrisy then to come along, as honourable members have said, and say, but of course our industry needs the orders, people want the jobs. You remember the joke about the man producing nuclear weapons in America, and somebody said, how could you do it? And he said, well, the man's got to live, hasn't he? And that is the argument, that somehow you can justify the supply of weapons in that way. The international arms trade is a greater threat to world peace than the AIDS epidemic or the drugs trade, because it's supported by governments. It props up dictators, the Shah, Batista, Marcos, Papadoc, all these people, Pinochet, props them up, and they get the weapons to crush their own people in the interests of keeping down their own people, so that the multinationals can make a profit from the superpowers that sell them the weapons. And then, because they bought the weapons, they get into trouble with the IMF, and the IMF comes along and says, cut your social budgets, because you've got to pay the debt on the arms you bought to keep down your own people. And of course the waste of skill. Some of the most brilliant scientists and engineers in the world are working on methods of death instead of the means of life. And billions and billions and billions of pounds are wasted on weapons that could have saved lives. And a heavy responsibility rests upon everybody, and I know every government to some extent has done it, who promotes the international arms trade. Because there have been 134 wars since 1945. Millions have died in them, using weapons that were supplied by the superpowers very often. And millions more died because they were denied the resources that were wasted in the arms program itself. Ministers will not tell the House the truth on this matter. Ministers use intelligence, and everybody knows it, we've had a reference to it, and are prepared to sacrifice intelligent people to conceal the truth. This is a matter the House should deal with by select committee. Look at Oliver North. They had him up before a congressional committee and they grilled him for weeks on it, on Watergate. When Peter Wright wrote a book saying he'd committed treason, they spent millions of pounds trying to prevent the book getting into the hands of the British people. Because the central question is, who is allowed to buy the weapons? Who controls it? Who knows what happens? Who tells the truth? And finally, does the House take the responsibility for holding government accountable? Or does it shuffle it off like so much else to a commission here, an agency there, or a High Court judge there? Because if it does that, we shall be burying this House as a historic defender of the rights of the people we represent, some of whom were sent to fight in Iraq against an army we had armed. What has been totally lacking from the party opposite has been any awareness of the sense of public outrage that people could be treated as the President of the Board of Trade treated them when he announced the closure of 21 pits. Individual members may have taken a different view. It was callous, it was brutal, it came from a party that prides itself on a citizen's charter and a classless society, and that is why hundreds of thousands of people are marching in London today. And this little seminar on gas prices doesn't get near what this whole argument is all about. And everybody knows on our side of the House that this is a sustained attack upon the mining industry because the previous Prime Minister regarded the NUM as the enemy within. That's what it's about. Of course, that's what it was about. The term the enemy within was covered for that reason. And it gives me huge pleasure that the Tory party threw out Thatcher and the miners re-elected Scargill, because that man told the truth, and truth still has a value in the politics of our society when all the lies and half-truths and half-promises about independent reviews are dismissed. The President of the Board of Trade said he agonized over the decision. He's not the one who's going to suffer the agony if any pits are closed. If he'd agonized, why didn't he have the review while he was agonizing, so people could have put alternative views in when he was discussing it? Why not spend months? I've got a letter here from Cecil Parkinson's office telling someone who wrote from Derbyshire the privatisation of electricity will have no effect whatever on coal closures. Ministers have lied and lied and lied about the mining industry, and that is why people are so incensed. And don't tell us it's market forces. If market forces applied to the farming industry, half the farms in Britain would have closed years ago, because you can get cheaper food from New Zealand and Australia, and the Tory party depends on the farmers. So they support, and I'm in favour. I'm not in favour of applying market forces to farms. You can't close a farm one year and open it the next. But the miners haven't had set-aside grants where they're given money not to produce coal, and that is the reality of this debate. Now, I might add that prepared to pay a lot of money to the gamblers 2 weeks ago when it was the so-called market forces working on the currency, and that, I think, has played a part. Now, let me turn to what is required. What we require now is a re-examination of energy policy, bringing the fuel suppliers, the fuel industries, and the suppliers, and the customers, and the unions together. We did it from 76 on. All the papers were published, the discussions were serious, and then when you do that, you have to ask, what's the objective of energy policy? I tell you, one of the objectives the last Labour government published, very simple. The object of energy policy was that everyone should have heat and light at home. Not a bad energy policy objective. in which you recognise that energy in the end is judged by whether people can get hold of it or not. Somebody said to me the other day, if there's excess coal, why don't you give it to the pensioners? A very sensible argument. You give it free to the generating board, who pump it down the wire as the chief elect. Well, the honourable gentleman nods, shakes his head, but that's an energy policy. But it's one they don't believe in, because they do believe in profit and not in people. And that's what this whole argument is about. Of course, you've got to look at imports, open cast.
Order. I understand there is a point of order. I hope it is a point of order.
It is indeed. Madam Deputy Speaker, is it in order for the right honourable gentleman to rewrite history?
Order. Order. One moment, Mr. Benn. That is clearly not a point of order, and I take strong exception to the use of points of order in that way, by either side. Mr. Benn.
Well, I hope that time is taken out, because I'm making a serious argument that's got more in common with what people outside think than the sort of little arguments we've had from those opposite. I finish with saying this, Madam Deputy Speaker. The vote tonight is not going to determine this matter, and if anybody thinks it is, they made a great mistake. The British public have been awakened, not just on the mining industry, but to the whole rotten philosophy of the 1980s, that it's all about cash, and you bring in a chartered accountant and he'll tell you what to do. It isn't about that. It's about whether our society puts people in a place of dignity and serves them, or whether you just hand over your money to gamblers who don't create any wealth at all. Arthur Scargill has been rehabilitated more quickly than any man I have known. In 24 hours, everybody knows he was right, the miners did. And what has happened, and I've warned the government about this and I finish with it, what's really happened is after 10 years, when people have taken things they should never have taken, there is a return of self-confidence and hope. Yeah. And it was self-confidence and hope that got Mandela out of prison, that got the Berlin Wall down, and will get the president out of his office in favour of a better sort of society. Yeah. The second thing is, despite the fact we've been told we're an entrepreneurial society, this is a country today that has an utter contempt for skill. You talk to people who dig coal, run trains, doctors, nurses, dentists, tool makers. Nobody in Britain is interested in them. The whole of this so-called entrepreneurial society has focused on the city news we get in every bulletin, telling us what's happened to the pound sterling to 3 points of decimals against a basket of European currencies. Skill is what built this country's strength, and it is treated with contempt. I must confess, the auctioning off of public assets, particularly the latest disgusting Frankenstein advertisements, which told me more about the mentality of the minister who devised the scheme than it did about the sale itself. These are assets built up by the labour of those who work in electricity and by the taxpayer who put the equipment in, now to be auctioned off at half their price to make a profit for a tax cut for the rich before the next election comes. If these were local councillors, they would be before the courts for willful misconduct. And because they are ministers, and then some of them later go on the boards of the companies they privatise, they are treated as businessmen who know better how to handle it as members of the board of directors than allegedly they did as ministers responsible. Local government has been crippled. Across the river is the London County Council County Hall, the seat of government of the greatest city in the world, empty, to be sold, because the government wanted to cripple local government. And so indeed they have. The poll tax, the centralisation of the business rate, the punishment of the Liverpool and Lambeth councillors was to take all power from local government and put it in the hands of a government that claimed it didn't believe in the role of the state. The undermining of the trade unions with less rights in Britain than they have in Eastern Europe. The tax cuts for the rich and benefit cuts for the poor, the censorship of the media, the abuse by the security services, the restriction of civil liberties. And when we look back on the 1980s, we will see many victims of market forces. I do not share the general view that market forces are the basis of political liberty. Every time I see a person in a cardboard box in London, I say that person is a victim of market forces. Every time I see a pensioner who can't manage, a victim of market forces. The sick who are waiting for medical treatment that they could accelerate by private insurance, they are the victims of market forces. And with the disappearance of the Prime Minister, who was a great ideologue, I mean, her strength was that she understood a certain view of life. And when she goes and she's gone, there will be a great ideological vacuum. And as Opal saying, we will run market forces better than she did, because her whole philosophy was that you measured the price of everything and the value of nothing. And we have to replace that. And I had one experience the other day which confirmed me in my view that she hasn't really changed the thinking or culture of the British people. I don't know how many people travel as I do on trains, but I go regularly on the trains and I see all the little businessmen with their calculators working out their cash flow, frowning people, looking and glaring at each other. Thatcherite trains, the train of the competitive society. But coming back from Chesterfield the other day, the train broke down. And on it wholly changed. Somebody came in, said, I have a cup of tea from my thermos. And then people looked after each other's children. And a young couple talked to me, and I said, after about half an hour, how long have you been married? Oh, we met on the train, they said. And a woman said, will you get off at Derby and ring my son in Swansea, because he'd be worried. By the time we got to London, we were a socialist train. Because you can't change human nature. There is good and bad in everybody, and for 10 years it is the bad and the good that has been denounced as lunatic, out of touch, cloud cuckoo land, extremist and militant. And that's what the party opposite have done. They don't quite yet know. They think it's the retirement of a popular headmistress under circumstances some might regret. Actually, they've killed the source of their own philosophy and opened the way for quite different ideas.